Hi, this is History MD coming to you with the continuation of our very first book review. In this video, we're going to tackle agriculture in the history of human diseases according to McKeown. Change happened rather quickly in our species' history following the agricultural revolution. Only about 12,000 years ago, that's just about 150 generations, all people on Earth could only consume what they hunted and gathered. The Neolithic Revolution that brought about agriculture transformed the way we lived and ate forever. Agriculture changed our health and increased the rate of growth of the total human population on this planet to a degree never seen in the hundreds of thousands of years of human existence. Some argue that people in the Middle East, or as I would like to call it, Southwest Asia, developed a superior interest in plants and animals due to environmental conditions, namely the drought that occurred near the very end of the Pleistocene epoch. Regardless of the exact reasons behind the separation, the invention of agriculture quickly spread all over Afro-Eurasia. Hunter-gatherers know that plants grow from seeds, and they understand the conditions under which plants and animals thrive. From this knowledge, it's not a huge step to control ecological conditions, and so anthropologists have concluded that the distinction between agricultural and pre-agricultural practices is not very great. But McKeown struggles with the question: why adopt agriculture when hunting and gathering worked so consistently for so long, as thousands of generations of humans lived and reproduced with this occupation? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But no, our ancestors made a conscious decision to abandon hunting and gathering to adopt agriculture. In a symposium, hunting was said to be the most successful and persistent adaptation man has ever achieved. Unquestionably, it was the most persistent adaptation since it lasted a few million years. And in many ways, it was successful, particularly from the viewpoint of the hunters unaware of the attractions of a more sophisticated life. For most of our ancestors around the globe, their diet provided a rich variety of vitamins, minerals, and proteins. Furthermore, with the inclusion of substantial amounts of meat, the food was more attractive than that of a farmer, based on one or two cereals. Moreover, there was a degree of security and continuity in the supply that was lost with the advent of agriculture, cultivated crops being more susceptible to climatic influences such as drought. Finally, if experience of present-day hunters can be taken as a guide, it was easier and more pleasant to obtain food by hunting and gathering rather than by agriculture. So McKeown asks, if agriculture provided neither better diet nor greater reliability or greater ease in food quest, if it did not of itself confer the capability of sedentary life, but conversely provided a poor diet, less reliably at equal or greater labor costs, why would anyone want to become a farmer? McKeown writes that agriculture had one huge advantage from a purely mathematical and logistical point of view. By providing greater amount of food per area of land, it could feed a greater and larger population. So, agriculture originated where greater productivity was required, and greater productivity was needed when population density increased. Therefore, the relation between food supplies and population growth is elementary. Of course, Thomas Malthus gives the famous interpretation following which variations of population size are determined by the availability of food. However, McKeown notes that Malthus underestimated the effect on population growth of limitation of numbers by methods other than moral restraint, and he had little to say about the possible influence of rising numbers on advances in agricultural technology. So, he turns to a different explanation offered by Boesrup, who turned the argument around. making population density the primary influence. In Population and Technology, published in 1981, Boesrup argues that the demands of rising numbers led to advance not only in agricultural technology, but also in the finance and building of physical and human infrastructure of various types, especially investment in water regulation, energy supply, and transportation. However, McKeown is cautious to accept the Boesrup argument, either because by focusing on technological change as a determinant of food supplies, it understates the importance of food as an influence on population size. Another plausible explanation is offered by Cohen in Food Crisis, who argue that some common factor is needed to account for the appearance of agriculture within a short period in many different parts of the world. He suggested that the human population has been growing throughout its history and that this expansion was a cause rather than merely a result of technological change. According to this view, by approximately 12,000 years ago, hunters and gatherers living on a limited range of preferred foods had, by natural population increase and concomitant territorial expansion, fully occupied those portions of the globe which would support their lifestyle with reasonable ease. This explanation being in accord with Malthus. To put the matter simply, population pressure led to acceptance of agriculture, but it was agriculture which made it possible to feed much larger numbers. So McKeown is not very clear on the how, but we don't expect him to be clear about this subject, which is the domain of paleoanthropologists. Regarding the health and disease following agriculture, he writes that two changes which resulted from agriculture had a peculiar impact on human health and disease. One, the increase in food supply and the subsequent population growth. Two, the creation of cities with large populations where increased concentrations of people were in constant contact with one another. Throughout the agricultural period, most people lived on and from the land, experiencing the considerable benefits and associated problems of rural life. Their diet, although different from that of human hunter-gatherers, was still based mainly on unrefined plant foods. They were not far removed from the conditions for which their genes had equipped them. The chief problem was their poverty, which deprived them of the essentials of life, and the most serious deficiency was in respect of food. McKeown writes that non-communicable diseases such as hypertension, obesity, diabetes, gallstones, renal stones, and coronary heart disease appear as rarely in primitive agriculturalists as they do in hunter-gatherers. Their rarity was attributed to the conditions of life and their increase since the 18th century to the adoption of the Western lifestyle. Most people still lived an active rural life, and even the minority living in the towns were not exposed to many of the hazards of the present day, such as atmospheric pollution, widespread use of chemicals, adverse working conditions, road traffic, tobacco, and drug abuse. The most important influences responsible for Western diseases began with industrialization. McKeown writes that under agriculture, there were two important changes in the types of food. Hunter-gatherers lived on meat, fish, fruit, and vegetables. On average, 2/3 of the diet came from plant sources. They were often not able to have cereals, and they had almost no dairy products. Under agriculture, man's diet also essentially consisted of vegetable foods, supplemented with meat and fish, where these were available. But the common vegetables were cultivated cereals, particularly wheat, rice, and maize. Dairy was a significant portion of the diet of only some populations. The consumption of cereals did not lead to a substantial increase in the frequency of non-communicable diseases. The human body had no difficulty in accepting cultivating cereals since it was well adapted to vegetables with a high proportion of carbohydrates. The problems were to arise later with the introduction of refined and processed foods, in which the starch was separated from the fiber. However, there were diseases related to the consumption of just a few cereals, such as beriberi, pellagra, riboflavin deficiency, and rickets. These all resulted largely from the dietary changes brought about by the Neolithic Revolution. The other significant change under agriculture was the consumption of dairy products, which were not available to hunter-gatherers. In the early modern period, cheese, milk, and eggs were eaten particularly by the poor, for whom they provided an important source of cheap protein. The use of butter in Europe was almost exclusive to the northern regions, and its use did not spread until the 18th century. In Turkey, milk products were the chief food of the poor, and they were popular throughout the Muslim world. China, Japan, and India, in contrast, made little to no use of dairy products. As recently as the late 19th century, cattle were grazed in Hyde Park in London to provide milk for the population. However, animals were maintained under more natural conditions than today, and dairy products were not open to some of the objections that have been raised in recent memory. On the whole, the effects of agriculture on non-communicable diseases were relatively minor, and the really important consequence was the creation of conditions which led to the predominance of infectious diseases as causes of sickness and death. But infectious diseases were another story. There were four main influences which led to the predominance of infectious diseases as causes of sickness and death. 1. The existence of populations large enough to enable some human infections to become established and others to be amplified. 2. Defective hygiene and crowding, which further increased exposure to communicable diseases. 3. Insufficient food, which lowered resistance to infection. And 4. Close contact with domesticated and other animals. The diseases which could not have existed in early man include most of those that were predominant in the historic period, with the exceptions of the herpes simplex, chickenpox, tuberculosis, leprosy, treponematosis. Their frequency depended more on hygienic conditions that influenced their spread. This all means that population size matters for diseases. For instance, Fenner in 1971 calculated that 3,000 cases are required in a year to maintain measles, and this would need a population of about 300,000. McKeown says that most human infections could not have been established until the populations in frequent contact reached many thousands. The great change in community size is believed to have begun about 6,000 years ago. Before that time, human settlements consisted of villages with less than 300 persons, much too small to maintain the human infections. It was only after the introduction of improved farming techniques that a few cities had about 100,000 people. And it's only in the last few centuries after industrialization that they have started harboring above 500,000. It is truly remarkable that we owe the origin of most serious infectious diseases to the conditions which led to our cultural heritage, the city-states made possible by the planting of crops in the floodplains of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. Just as the proximity of large numbers of people facilitated the spread of airborne and other infections, hygienic conditions were also significant. Cholera appeared when villages and village water supplies were established, and malaria became serious when the size of human populations and the opportunities for breeding of vectors increased with advances in agricultural practices. Tuberculosis, possibly an ancient disease, could almost be described as a disease of cities, for it became a common cause of death under the conditions prevailing in large towns. The same goes for intestinal infections such as typhoid, dysentery, and salmonella, which resulted from contamination of food and water. So, the hygienic conditions which followed the introduction of agriculture made it possible for new diseases to appear. But what are the sources of human infections? McKeown writes that although knowledge of infectious diseases in the wild is still very incomplete, it is now clear that many human parasites had precursors in other animals. There has been a continuous exchange of infective organisms between man and other animals. Contact with other animals increased under agriculture, with domesticated animals such as cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, cats, and dogs, and with unwanted intruders attracted to human settlements such as rats, mice, sparrows, ticks, fleas, and mosquitoes. For instance, measles is believed to have originated in dogs. While the common cold appears to be derived from horses. Tuberculosis probably came from cows, while leprosy is believed to have come from the water buffalo. Meanwhile, syphilis might originate from monkeys. And plague is believed to have originated as an inapparent infection of gerbils in Eastern Asia. The first great pandemic occurring in the 6th century CE. The human virus of influenza appears to be similar with the virus of the swine influenza. In regards to population growth, McKeown writes that agriculture allowed an increase in human population unparalleled during prehistory. However, the increase was not effectively limited by social restraints, and populations expanded to the size at which food supplies became again marginal. Famine was common, and the relatively slow rate of population growth was due essentially to defective hygiene and food deficiency. So, according to McKeown, it was not agriculture which was the primary mover of modern human diseases. Next, we tackle the third chapter in the history of human diseases, industry. So if you like the video, be sure to leave a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and state your historical emergency in the comments below. Thanks for watching!